We're now going to move on to the panel discussion. We are very pleased to introduce Julian Caldecott, who's going to introduce and host this discussion. Julian is one of our trustees on the Scottish Wildlife Trust board. He's also a member of Conservation Committee, one of our hardworking committees. Before he joined the Trust as an ecologist and writer, Julian worked on tropical wildlife research and conservation in the main, and was working on solutions to challenges on biodiversity, ecosystems, and climate change. He's particularly passionate on the subject of peace with nature. And so I'm delighted to hand over to Julian, who is going to introduce today's panelists and take forward the remaining item on our agenda. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you so much, Linda. That's very, very pleasant. And good morning to everybody. Yes, as well, welcome to the webinar on peace with nature. As my name is, as Linda just mentioned, Julian Caldecott. I'm an ecologist, and although a trustee of the Wildlife Trust, of course, in this role, I'm involved myself in my personal capacity. Now, just a few words of introduction. Peace with nature is a very powerful idea that I guess has its origins in a 2007 policy by the government of Costa Rica, where it means a combination of ecologically aware, green and equitable development based on phasing out fossil fuels and non-biodegradable plastics, environmental education for all, and a very innovative and diverse program of saving and using biodiversity for public benefit and sustainability. So this has, in Costa Rica, has a long trajectory, and of course that's founded on 10 or more years before that of various kinds of work. More recently, Peace with Nature has been endorsed by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, he described it as the top priority for everyone, everywhere. So effectively, the concept of peace with nature has now been internationalized and become part of the thought leadership of the world. Certainly, peace with nature is needed. We all know about the deforestation, the global heating, mass extinction, melting Arctic, the accumulating signs of tipping points in major Earth systems, which all seem to be converging on big problems in the middle part of the century. So we really need to get a grip on this. The question is whether peace with nature has the potential, which I believe it does, to validate and encourage everyone's existing conservation, ecological restoration, environmental education activities, because there are millions of people involved in this all over the world. Also the potential to lead us in the direction of new economic tools and systems, perhaps even in the direction of system change itself. So the question really now is what does peace with nature mean specifically for us all, and how can we build it in Scotland and everywhere else? You know, some things to consider while asking that question are nature, it seems to me, is a much bigger concept than just resources for human use. It refers to the whole web of life, even many people's views a sacred web of life. Also, peace with nature is much more inclusive and universal than just science-based policy or science-based policy for development. In the sort of broader sense, it links with other thematic activities going on around the world, or new forms of thought. For example, the rights of Mother Earth campaigns emanating from South and Central America, which are having quite a lot of traction in the West through the United Nations, the COP26 led by Bolivia, but also more close to home, you know, these sort of rights of Mother Earth feeding through into legal discussions about ecocide, and also motivating people like the Extinction Rebellion movements, which are starting their campaign today, actually a new campaign today. So this broad, it's part of peace with nature seems to represent a family of connected ideas, which are very interesting. Anyway, we feel it's time to open up the discussion on this subject. and hoping this panel now can be a start. It'll be recorded, and of course and produce a YouTube for wide circulation afterwards. So I'm very privileged to have with us four excellent panelists. Neville Ash, who's the director of the United Nations Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Centre, who's been with the UN Environment since 2010 and has led the UN Environment's work on biodiversity. So he's very much engaged with the thought leadership role of the UN in relation to peace with nature. He also helped found the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So, so I'm going to ask him to open with some thoughts from that angle. Then he'll be followed by Mary Michel, who's a trustee of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in Scotland. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance is both a Scottish thing, but is also linked with other countries such as Iceland, Finland, Wales, New Zealand. So it's very interesting, cutting-edge thinking on economic principles. She also works on circular economy through education and mindset change. Then she'll be followed by Professor Rob Brooker from the James Hutton Institute, who is a specialist and expert on agrobiodiversity and food security, the whole issue of conserving biodiversity in living landscapes that are also inhabited by people. And then we'll come to Sarah Robinson, who's the Director of Conservation at the Scottish Wildlife Trust. So we've already heard something from her, but she can here connect the peace with nature idea to the whole issue of wildlife reserve management, innovative partnerships, living landscape programs, and so forth. So it's an excellent panel. I've asked each panelist to speak for about up to about 7 minutes on what peace with nature means to them and how do they think we can build solidarity around the idea of peace with nature, or some variant of that sort of line of inquiry. I mean, I'm not going to be dictating that too vigorously, but anyway, that's a general line. So we're also privileged to be at the Scottish Wildlife Trust AGM, of course, and in Scotland, which means that we're surrounded by and connected with very many committed people. And all those committed people have other networks. So this is a great opportunity to bring in and broaden or start a broader discussion on peace with nature and what it means for Scotland's future and the world's future. We want to, in that spirit, we want to reserve some minutes at the end for Q&A. So I could ask you to post questions in the Q&A tab and vote for ones you like, I guess, because we'll have a sort of automated system to bring the most popular question to the front, because obviously we're going to be limited for time. We have to end promptly at 12:40. So we'll answer what we can, but of course, those questions will carry on being thought about, I hope, by the panel later on, so they won't be wasted. So now I'd like to maybe welcome Neville to start the ball rolling with the UN's perspective and his perspective on this whole interesting topic. Thanks, Neville Ash.
Wonderful, Julian. Thank you so much indeed, and thank you to the Scottish Wildlife Trust for hosting this very interesting panel session we're about to have. So at a global level, we're facing a triple planetary crisis. We have a problem with climate change, we have a problem with pollution, and we have a problem with the loss and degradation of nature. And making peace with nature does require addressing all three of these global challenges. And we're all very familiar with the climate change. We've achieved already a 1.1 degree warming from pre-industrial level. That's leading to the kind of disruptions we've seen around the world this summer with floods and droughts and heat waves and other extreme weather. We're on track for a 3 degree warming and over 2 degrees, even with all the commitments and pledges taken on board from Glasgow and before. We're going backwards on emissions. We're supposed to be coming down to halve our emissions by the end of this decade. The emissions are still going up. And as Julian mentioned, we're seeing the possibility of some pretty horrendous tipping points in the global climate system playing out at the regional level from even just at 1.5 degree increases. So we have a huge challenge with climate change, which we need to tackle. Pollution, whether it's plastic, nutrient pollution, including from sewage in the headlines recently in the UK, of course, agricultural runoff, pesticide use, and other pollution. We are facing a huge global challenge with pollution. 2/3 of our marine life is under threat from plastic pollution and overfishing. And then the third global crisis, nature, 1 million species at risk around the world, 10 million hectares of forests being lost every year in recent years, the average rate of decline at around 70% in populations of species that have been well monitored over the last 50 years. So all these three crises need to be addressed if we're going to make peace with nature, but they're also interdependent. So we cannot make peace with nature unless we tackle the climate change and pollution crises. One of the big changes in the last couple of years has been the transition in thinking at all scales from nature as something we impact on, something we need to reduce the impacts on, to something which not just we impact on, but also we are dependent on. So 1/3 of the solution required for mitigating climate change, keeping global temperature rise to 1.5 or 2 degrees, comes from managing the environment. Half of our global GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature. A recognition that our health is dependent on nature too, mental health and disease. 60% of infectious diseases are zoonotic, coming from animals. And because of this recognition, nature has increased in prominence on public, business and political radars over the last 2 decades, quite a lot at all scales. And we now have this abundance of commitments and pledges from public and private sectors at the international level, national level, the Paris Agreement on climate change, the Glasgow leaders' declaration, of course, on forest and land use from the climate COP last year, and many, many national commitments. We've got a very strong scientific underpinning to understand what the problems are and what the solutions are. And this year, governments will agree on the next global plan for nature at the UN Biodiversity Conference, hosted by China, but taking place in Canada, in Montreal, later this year. And this new plan will set a new set of ambitions for 2030 targets, milestones towards a 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. So we have no shortage of ambitions. But whether on tackling deforestation, addressing the threatened status of species, protecting important sites for biodiversity around the world, we have failed in the last couple of decades to meet any of the international targets on nature, including those which are critical to make progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. And this failure comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to the world that is our home. It comes at a cost to society from a breakdown in the relationship between people and nature, and it comes at a cost to our economies. So what do we need to do if we're going to make peace with nature? Well, the problem is we've been focusing on ambitious outcomes, halting the loss of nature, addressing the threatened status of species, and using very ambitious rhetoric, but we've not been delivering collectively on the actions required to achieve those outcomes. We know if we're going to halt the loss of nature, we need to address all the causes of the loss of nature. Underlying these predominantly is unsustainable consumption and production. So yes, we need to change global food systems and food supply systems. What we eat matters. We need to change global finance systems. Where we invest our money matters. We need to change global energy systems. Where we get our energy from matters for nature. And this implies systemic, transformative changes across the whole of society and economy, not just a bit more here or there, or a bit more of the same, or scaling up a little bit. And definitely the solutions to making peace with nature are not someone else's job. Everyone across society, all parts of society, have a role to play. So urgent, deep, broad action required. And as with climate, it's very clear that we do have a last chance decade to address the nature crisis. The current slogan that's gaining traction internationally is nature positive. So if we're going to make peace with nature, we need to aspire to a nature positive world. One of the key promising solutions, of course, having degraded and lost nature at such high rates over recent decades, is on restoration. And restoration is a critically important tool we're going to need to deploy in order to meet climate ambitions, in order to restore polluted areas, and in order to restore populations and systems within nature. And the wonderful thing to me about restoration is it is a global priority, but needs to play out, as with all actions for nature, also at national, local, and very local levels. We can all restore elements of our back gardens for nature. We also need to do a much better job on transparency. So we need to make sure we have a clear understanding of progress that's being made. At the moment, we have huge gaps around the world in different monitoring systems to understand progress that's being made toward global, national and local ambitions for nature. So we must strengthen our monitoring to understand progress, and that needs to feed back in to understanding the effectiveness of actions and the progress being made so that we can step them up urgently as well. So to me, making peace with nature requires both the urgent delivery of the actions required to address the nature crisis and the urgent delivery of actions along with climate and pollution crises as well. And to do that is going to require that we recognize in the decisions we make the multiple values of nature. So we need to understand, yes, the economic dependencies we have on nature. We need to understand the health dependencies we have on nature. We need to understand the cultural affinity we have with nature. We need to understand the intrinsic values of nature, the amazingness of nature, and how we take that on board in the decisions that are taken as individuals, as families, as organizations, as local and national governments, and as businesses in all parts of the world. So I'll leave it with those introductory thoughts, Julian, and look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks, Neville. That's very inspiring and challenging and uplifting and worrying all at the same time. But anyway, it's good. We'll come back to many of those points. So could I ask Mary, I think, to take up the baton for the next perspective?
Thank you, Julian. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you all on this nice sunny day. So I co-founded Austrero with my colleague Marion Brown in 2016 to grow the circular economy in Scotland. And as Julian said, I'm also a trustee of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So both of these are about big economic systems change. And a strong thread that runs through both organisations is that we need to move from our current extractive economic model of perpetual growth, where I would say we're more at war with nature, to a regenerative system where we recognise and respect the limits of our natural world and create a system where we can be at peace with nature. So what I mean by that is we want to move from what we're currently doing. We're in a linear economy where we take stuff out of the ground, we make something with it, we use it maybe only once or twice if you think about a disposable coffee cup or water bottle, and then we chuck it away without really worrying about where it ends up. We're in a system where we over-extract the limited resources that we have and where we generate huge amounts of needless waste at so many stages of production of goods and systems. So taking food as just one example, 1/3 of the food produced globally is wasted every year, 1/3. So these huge amounts of needless waste are something we want to move right away from. So we want to move towards a model that puts us at peace with nature, where there's much more circular thinking. The whole life cycle of any product or system being designed needs to be taken into account from the very earliest design stage. And nature is a great inspiration for this because there's so little waste in nature and everything feeds into something else. We want to move to a system where we keep materials at their highest value for as long as possible. So we're not just chucking them away after one use, and we're really making the most of the materials that we do need to use. And where waste is a thing of the past, and we really can design out waste. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation estimate that if you start right at the beginning of the design stage, you can cut out 80% of the environmental impact of a product or a system. And we want to move to a much more respectful relationship with nature, where we're an integral part of the natural system, not just a bystander looking on and wondering what we can get out of it. So how do we go about achieving this? I think it's a combination of big picture thinking, so systems change, as Neville was saying, big picture thinking like today, where lots of people get together to think about and discuss different and better ways of doing things, and education. And that's where we really focus our work at Austrero. So we work with children across Scotland aged between 7 and 15. And we work with them to look at how are things designed, made, used and disposed of, and why, and how might we do things better. So Neville also mentioned the unsustainable consumption and production that we have in our current system. And what we're trying to get them to think about is our houses are all crammed full of stuff, and we're constantly being encouraged to buy more stuff, keep the economy growing, but we're not encouraged to think about, do we want it? Do we need it? Does it make it happy? What impact does it have on the world around us? So I think alongside those big picture education pieces, we need to think about small, local, personal changes that we can all make, and we can all make straight away, because systems changes takes time, but we can start doing things straight away. So that could be small things like encouraging bees and butterflies in your garden. It could be buying secondhand clothes or choosing food that has less or no packaging. we at Australia at the moment are working with 20 schools on a zero waste guide for schools. So we've gone from the big picture thinking in the workshops where we look at why do we need systems change and how can we do it, right back down to, okay, what are 20 things that you can do in your school starting today to cut down on waste? And of course, there's always the argument that these small local gestures are futile in the face of the urgency and the scale of the problem. But I think they're really important. So I think they do add up to change. And I also think they encourage thinking about the world we live in and how we can have a better relationship with nature and do things differently. So they need to happen alongside campaigning for systems change. But I think they're important in themselves. And I just wanted to finish up by saying, coming from a slightly different angle, just the importance of nature in getting these sometimes quite complex messages across to people, and especially to children. So in our schools workshops, we work with children as young as 7, and the idea or the term of a circular economy is quite complex in itself. So using stories about nature is a really effective way of engaging and getting these messages across. One story that we often use is about Lulu, the orca whale, whose body was beached off the island of Tiree a few years ago. And I don't know if you know Tiree, but it has turquoise, clean, clear waters, white, spotless sands. It looks like the least polluted place you can imagine. But when scientists did tests on her body to find out why she died, they found that she was one of the most contaminated marine mammals found anywhere in the world. She's never been able to have a calf because of this, and they think the whole pod will die out. So using this story as a way to engage people with the problems that are out there, to say we've got these incredible animals living right alongside us, but we as humans are having a devastating impact on them, is a really effective way to talk about these complex things and start to think about how we could build a better and more peaceful relationship with nature. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Mary. That's great. I mean, obviously, Scotland, I understand, is a really strong storytelling culture anyway, and so this is great. We must, there's 101 thoughts come to mind, but I think before we babble about them, we've got to pass on to Rob perhaps to produce his own perspective.
Thanks very much, Julian. I mean, that's a great starting off point, although as Julian said, I do work at the Hutton, so I'm here on this lovely sunny morning, I think with my own thoughts. So I think what we shouldn't take is anything that I say as sort of representing a standardized Hutton viewpoint, but it is lovely to be able to contribute. And although sort of Julian introduced me as a specialist on agro-biodiversity and food security, which I do work on a bit now, but I have colleagues who are much more informed on that than me. I think I'm probably a jack of all trades and master of none. So I've worked on all sorts of ecosystems over the years, many of them in Scotland, but also internationally, from high mountaintop systems down to sort of coastal dune systems. And across there, I've looked at the impacts, the drivers of biodiversity change and the consequences of that for system function. And that includes productivity for food and conservation benefit as well. So this is a really interesting discussion to get engaged with. And we had a little pre-chat earlier in the week about the concept of making peace with nature, and that really prompted some thinking for me. And I think, as Mary said, in some cases, perhaps the counterpoint is that we've been at war with nature. And I sat there and I thought, well, have we actually been at war with nature? Have we set out with the active purpose of destroying nature? And I couldn't really think that in many cases that was the case. The only cases I thought sort of really leapt to mind were perhaps our interactions with top predators. And if any of you have read Barry Lopez's fantastic book of Wolves and Men, that gives an excellent example of where we really actively set out to destroy a species in North America. And it went far beyond the economic costs of having wolves within the system and became almost a sort of religious fervor. And that, I think, was a good example of war. We set out to destroy. But I think actually more frequently, what we've done is the consequence of our ignorance. And it's hard to believe in many cases that we can affect something which is as big as nature. And a really nice example of that is the passenger pigeon in North America. And we talked about this as well earlier in the week. For those people, that were colonizing North America, it was almost impossible to imagine that shooting some of these birds would ultimately end in the loss of these million-strong flocks which were migrating across the continent. So we're there in a state of ignorance, both about what we're doing to nature and also our potential impact. And if it's a war, I was thinking it feels more like the kind of war that teenagers have with their parents, where what you're doing is you're fighting your ties to your parents while failing to recognize your dependencies. And actually you move away from that wall through a period and a process of maturation, and making peace with nature might then be like more like adult relationships that many parents and children hopefully can experience, which are based on understanding and knowledge and empathy. So that is what I think is that's the switch that we need to make as we move towards this peace with nature concept. That's that change in our thinking. And so if making peace with nature is in part about understanding and what's new in our understanding, and then from a scientific perspective, I think this is a key role. So it's our ability to influence that understanding. So important scientific inputs into the concept of peace with nature, firstly, that recognition of what we're doing to the planet. And this has increased hugely, both because we've had long-term monitoring, standardized monitoring. So activities such as Countryside Survey in the UK, which I'm sure many of you know about, which enables us to track our impact on nature through time and understands what's driving that, pollution or land use or climate change. And amazing new technologies that we have now. We have satellite networks which enable us to monitor the globe. We have deep sea unmanned automated vehicles which can sample plastics in these deep trenches. And we have techniques such as environmental DNA, whereby simply taking a sample of water from a river, we can find what species are living there. So science helps us understand what we're doing. And it also means that we understand what the consequences of that are going to be for us. So the last 20, 30 years, I think, have seen a massive shift in terms of our understanding of the role that biodiversity plays in delivering products and services that we're completely dependent upon. And if you synthesize those studies, what it clearly shows is this positive relationship that if you have more biodiversity, you have more resilient, better functioning systems that deliver better for humanity and for wider nature. But I think a key thing there is if we always come back to that utilitarian approach, then the risk is that we drill down only onto those organisms that we know are delivering something for us. And as I think it was Bob Mays, a great ecologist, said, the first rule of tinkering is don't throw away the pieces, right? So just because we don't know what some stuff does doesn't mean it's not worthwhile keeping. And we could keep it both for its potential function, but also because it's important and we have a responsibility. So understanding also helps us provide a better way forward, I think, in terms of looking at how we can live more harmoniously with nature. And this is coming through in concepts such as nature-based solutions, for example, nature-based flood risk management, nature-based systems for storing carbon, how peatland restoration can help us there, and concepts such as ecological intensification in farming. So is peace with nature a sudden step change? Is there a silver or a green bullet? I don't think so. Nature is very complex and the things that we're doing are very complex. And so what we need is a toolkit of solutions which we can pull on and which are relevant in many places. Small changes can help, but as was mentioned by Mary, they can seem trivial. So I think it's important that conservation actions by organisations such as Scottish Wildlife Trust give us hope and give us a focus and something that we can see as what we can achieve collectively. But we have to accept that not everyone will or can buy into that vision of making peace with nature to the same extent. Some people simply have limits on their ability both to act and to invest. So, and especially at times like the current economic crisis, we can see that some people don't have the same leverage. So it's really important that governments take a leading role. And I think it's excellent personally that Scottish Government has declared a nature emergency to map onto our climate emergency and recognises that addressing both is essential. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot deal with them independently. And the role of scientists there is to support, I think, through monitoring and through advice on management options, which are applicable in lots of different circumstances and scales. So overall, I think we need to move to a more mature, informed and responsible relationship with nature. And as scientists, we have a key role to play in working with organisations such as Scottish Wildlife Trust to define targets for action, which will really make a difference. And finally, what I think I'd like to do is just to come back to that point of how we interact with nature. And I would say that scientists, although our day job is to look at things in a hopefully quite logical way, put the data there and test things, I think it's important to remember that we're all people too. And for many of us, we're passionately devoted to nature, and it's that spiritual and emotional commitment that we have that drove us to become ecologists in the first place. So we're not sort of almost android-like machines. We have the same passion that everybody else has. We have to curb that passion sometimes to just focus on the data. But we totally buy into the fact that there is not just this logical relationship with nature, but also very strong spiritual relationships, which are flagged up as part of the making peace with nature concept. So at that point, I'll finish, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be with you this morning.
Rob, thanks very much. Blimey, there's so much being covered here so fast that I'm sure, well, my head is spinning. I don't know what the audience is doing, but anyway, hopefully they'll be formulating some interesting questions. But anyway, that's great. Shall we move on to Sarah, who will give us the, looking at the 4 inputs so far, I've made a note sort of thought leadership for the UN, strategic thinking for the Wellbeing Alliance and the Circular Economy, vital stuff from you, Rob. And I think Sarah is going to veer towards the more practical, but we'll see. Anyway, Sarah.
Thanks, Julian. Yes, yeah, I would say I'm going to bring this sort of sprinkle the practical element on here and champion and highlight what the Trust has been doing in this space since its inception, really. And I would say that people are part of nature. Back to sort of Rob's initial statement around, are we really at war with nature? Is that the right thing to say? And I think many ecologists and conservationists have, for centuries, or for over a century, definitely been highlighting the need for humans to transform themselves from conquerors of nature into citizens of it, and argued that we should be transferring our focus from considering the natural world as a source of economic production to protecting the interests of natural world. So touching on what a lot of people I think are saying, it's the framing that we have to work on and the understanding of the people around us. Because of course, as ecologists, conservationists, scientists in this space, we've all thought that for a long time, and I think have perhaps wrongly and falsely assumed that other people get it. So it is regrettable, I think, for many of us that it's taken reaching a crisis point for these sort of concepts to be more widely accepted and acknowledged. But I think it's step one, isn't it? Greater understanding throughout society of the state of nature and our climate is making the changes that we require possible. So we have to view this still with a positive sort of outlook that we can make the difference. And the Trust staff, members, partners and supporters have, of course, through the charity's existence, which is nearing 60 years now, been at the forefront of voicing the issues and championing the causes of wildlife and our natural environment. But we've also delivered solutions through protecting and enhancing some of Scotland's precious habitats and species, owning and managing reserves, but also in combination with that, delivering innovative projects such as the Scottish Beaver Trial, and all at the same time as inspiring people to take positive action through our engagement and education activities. So I would say that the Trust is at peace with nature, and the people who are part of the Trust see themselves as part of nature. So we do recognise, though, that not everyone has that same worldview. So I think that's really where a lot of our work is coming from and continues to come from, that we're trying to find ways to frame the situation and seek to show people, particularly decision makers, why they're part of nature and how it connects to them and their interests. So to support the journey towards everyone making peace with nature and playing their part in living more sustainably, we've taken nature conservation out of its silo and made it a much stronger element of socioeconomic considerations and decisions. So we've been making the links between healthy environment, healthy economy, people's well-being, and ultimately the prosperity of Scotland. So, you know, what's sometimes referred to as the 3 pillars of sustainability. And that we've always sort of used the term the ecosystem approach to underpin a vision which is about scaling up Scotland's nature conservation efforts from the species and site focused activities, you know, from these spaces that are somebody else's responsibility, to the ecosystem and landscape scale, to the society's responsibility, to all of our responsibility. It's not something us, the conservation people, are going to do. It's something we all have a requirement to be involved in and to think about. So to draw on one example, because there's many from the Trust, but the ecosystem approach is at the centre of our living landscapes. And some of you have heard about those. You know, we've got Quirk and Aston, we've got Cambernauld, and we've got Edinburgh. And in all these locations, we're seeking to network our reserves with the wider landscape and other nature-rich sites, and crucially work with and alongside communities of place and interest in realising gains for nature. So we come together in partnerships to think about how we manage land, to do more for wildlife, people, and the economy. So not siloing those things, bringing them all together and seeking to sort of achieve a truly living landscape where ecosystems are restored, societies benefit from the vital services that our environment provides, and people are living at peace with nature. So I think that sort of gives you a brief insight into how we're thinking, I guess, about making peace with nature, and also how we're seeking to peace build amongst society. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, because I think, as Julian's noted, so much has been covered, and I think this is a topic we could talk about all day.
Wow, thank you, Sarah. Well, of course, we could maybe we can carry on talking about it all day after the cameras switch off. I don't know, but no, I mean, we'll just have to carry on. This is the start, after all. But yeah, well, your description of Scotland and what Nature Trust, Wildlife Trust is doing in Scotland, I suppose sums up why I feel so happy being in Scotland now after a lifetime working in other countries where there's much less volunteerism, NGO participation, sensitivity to history, environment, culture, landscape, wildlife. Somehow it's an amazing, it's the most, what's the word, encouraging environment I've been in. So that's great. Of course, it also feels like I should go back into more difficult places to actually earn my corn, but hey ho. No, it's all very encouraging. Can I just quickly, we've got a few minutes spare, not spare, but you know, can I just run back through a couple of notes I made from all of your talks, and then if anyone wants to kind of bat some ideas to and fro, then before we go on to the questions. I mean, I was struck by Neville's comment, for example, that you know our problems are we've been focused on outcomes and rhetoric. We now need systemic transformative changes. My question there is, how do we make systemic transformative change wanted and acceptable by people? I mean, this is inconvenient to make huge changes to everything. And that's kind of where I sort of feel this Peace with Nature thing might make a useful contribution, is to sort of somehow bounce people to a different level, to think more that it's actually worth making these sacrifices, worth making these changes. It provides a kind of rationale for it. Then similarly, Mary's comment, obviously Michel's work is building this additional perspectives from the bottom up in terms of young people's minds, building that respectful relationship with nature. And as I mentioned at the time, you know, the importance of story is absolutely vital, and just never forget that, because it does seem, several meetings recently I've been to in other contexts, it always comes back to, can we embed what we need to happen in some system that makes sense? Indeed, that's what I was saying just now about Peace with Nature as a vision, a perspective on human life in the world that makes inconvenient changes make sense. That's kind of, I think, where we're going with that. And yes, hitting people young is great. Hitting or reaching out to people in communities is also great. Coming to Rob's comments, yeah, no, absolutely. What something Neville said on our previous meeting was that Antonio Guterres sort of started off on this talking about bemoaning the war with nature, and then Neville's input and others led him more towards a more positive spin on it, which is basically about building peace. I've also worried about whether this notion of war is, you know, how valid is it as a metaphor for what we've been doing? And I grant that most of it's about carelessness, although I also noticed that historically, you know, carelessness can do a lot of damage in very many different contexts. But yeah, I totally agree with the idea that where this is going is a maturation of thinking, and that understanding of consequences and recognition of what we're doing and so forth. Again, I wonder whether this can be used as a basis for what the Andean peoples might describe as a reciprocal relationship between humanity and nature. So it's sort of concept of reciprocity is embedded in the whole value system. Might be where we need to go on that. But meanwhile, science, speaking as some sort of scientist, I agree, is essential to provide that kind of understanding, recognition of what we're doing, and understanding the consequences for that. Interesting. We must think about, yes, clearly governments have a vital leadership role, and in the last 20 or so years, I've noticed that governments have increasingly tended to get a bit slopey-shouldered about responsibility for leadership, and I think that's a trend which kind of needs to be resisted. We actually do need governments to step up and be much more proactive in what they're doing, and you know, stop telling tall stories, but you know, be honest with what they can and can't do, what their people are willing to pay for, and lead people properly by explaining what needs to be paid for, what needs to be done if we're all going to survive. So, you know, governments have a unique role there. Groups like Wildlife Trust, major NGOs, clearly have another major role. I think the idea of giving us hope to underwrite all the many millions of things that individuals can do, which can all add up. Yeah, they have a role in exploring and putting things together into a convincing story that actually makes sense. So that's extremely vital. I'm totally on side with the idea that scientists are humans too, and we're all fretting about this emotionally. We all have ecological grief. I would point out that ecological grief is probably best addressed by being with other people and sharing it, rather than worrying about it at home. So that's one of the major roles of volunteerism and the kind of practical work, the healing of people's upset that can result from being in nature and working with nature and replanting things and managing nature. So there's a number of motivations there that can come together and push in the same direction. I love the idea that the trust is at peace with nature. Thank you, Sarah. I treasure that, and you're reaching out to sort of support the journey of everyone to make peace with nature. And the idea of a truly living landscape that can be rolled out with everybody's support, vision, enthusiasm, and the healing effects of that worldwide is magnificent. So, well, anyway, that's kind of my thoughts. If anyone wants to say anything quickly, they can do. Otherwise, we can switch over to questions.
Julian, maybe a quick comment, and also because there's some brilliant questions coming in. Maybe we can start to sort of, thread some of these questions, some thoughts on the questions into some comments already. And just going back to the concept of making peace with nature, and a number of Rob and others have mentioned this. Actually, nature is our greatest ally in the challenges we face for the future. So addressing climate change, ensuring our well-being, we need nature on board as our ally. So to me, reframing the narrative around our dependency on nature, the ally that nature is to meet our societal needs on a whole range of challenges we face is most important. The issue of food has come up on a number of different interventions, and Mary, Rob, and others, and a couple of comments in the chat box there as well, the question box. So food systems are globally the most important driver of biodiversity loss, both on land and in the ocean. So the over-extraction of seafood and the loss of habitats on land to farm is the largest cause globally of biodiversity loss. And Mary mentioned that around a third of the food we produce is wasted. Well, if you take that back a step, that means that actually it's about 30% of the land on which we grow agricultural produce is land we are consuming to grow things on, but is never used. The products are never used because they are wasted either on farm or after harvest. So 30% of global land under agricultural production is not being used. That's extremely inefficient. And it's 30% of the around half of the planet, which is terrestrial systems of the planet, which are under production, which could otherwise be restored for nature. So we're missing some huge opportunities there, and low-hanging fruit, you might say, to address this challenge. And what it means for individuals, and this just responds to Colin's point there as well, is that yes, what you eat does matter. In fact, for most people in this part of the world, our dietary choice is likely to be the greatest individual influence we can have on the nature crisis. What we eat really does matter. I just want to pick up as well quickly on Roger's point. So the other thing I think we need to avoid at all costs is feeling happy that the next generation are much more ecologically literate and active than the current generation. To me, this would be an abdication of responsibility. We cannot leave the challenges we face to the next generation. In fact, quite the opposite. The urgency of the challenges we face, the nature crisis we face, requires that the current generation address the crisis in order to enable the next generation to thrive on the planet. Thanks.
Thank you, Neville. So it's all down to us. We mustn't neglect this. Of course, unless anyone else has a comment, we can start addressing these rather challenging questions that are starting to trickle in. If we want. I mean, I don't know.
I'm happy to chip in, Julian, and maybe pick up a couple of the questions in the same way that Neville did, and just also respond to what Neville was saying. I mean, I think the point that Neville made, that the food system is, a massive driver of biodiversity decline and function loss is really critical. What's been noticeable in some of the discussions that I've been having with farmers about sustainable production systems is how poorly sustainability is actually integrated into some of our training. And before I started working more with farmers, I think I probably fell into the mistake of putting farmers into a black box in terms of their desire to an impact on nature. And many of them have gone a long way down the path of thinking about how they can make their food systems more sustainable. But a lot of the feedback I've got is actually the basic educational frameworks we have for farmers do not focus on them as custodians of the landscape and of nature. It's still very focused on food production and yield as the primary product. And so, that's the way they're being trained in, and the process of land management is being framed. And there are other structural issues as well around farming. So, for example, if you're a tenant farmer, the investment in the long-term management of the land, because you're not going to pass that land on to your children, you've got a finite amount of time to generate income from that. And then actually currently, because of market structures, one of the most straightforward ways of doing that is just to focus on standard production systems. So I think there are things that we can do to train people better and to get the message out there, but people are working within constraints which may prevent them from doing the things that we all sit there and think, clearly we should do this, and yet why don't we do that? And people are laboring within frameworks. So we need to look at the governance frameworks and the market frameworks which are preventing people to moving to a more sustainable future. And I think there is, as well as we can't offload the need to act now. So Roger asked about, the need to, can this attitude only be altered by changing and thinking of our children and young people in terms of, the relationship between people and environment? I think certainly in the UK, there is a large disconnect from nature. And I sort of see it in discussions in my own village about the need to weed local sort of footpaths and things like that. And let's say the misidentification of certain umbellifer species, everything that's an umbellifer is defined as a giant hogweed and things like this. And that's simply because people have moved away from common interactions with nature. And I think there is a job of work to do there, to make people feel more comfortable in the countryside and open up the countryside and encourage people, particularly from urban settings, back into the countryside. She's talking to a farm manager from in the Central Belt, where we have one of our research farms. Some people are just actually quite anxious about going into the countryside. And that's a remarkable statement, that they don't know how to access and then interact with the countryside. So making it easy for people to do that interaction will then get rid of some of this fear that might sort of drive some of these responses that we see. So that's kind of, I think that's starting to sort of address a couple of the issues that are there in the discussion, and I'll stop at that point.
On that last point, I was wondering whether if Peace with Nature might embrace a number of things. Obviously at one end, the sort of great strategic issues, but another end, the individual commitment. Individuals could swear peace with nature, if you like, making a covenant. And then part of that would be to develop their sensitivity and experience of nature. And that, they'd actually be encouraging themselves to go into the countryside, walk around at night without a torch, go badger watching, do these things that, learn new things. It would provide some reason for them to do it, if you like, to be in line with a commitment somehow, rather than it being sort of helicopter and parachuted in on them through any kind of school system or whatever. But I don't know.
Just to that, Julian, if I could jump in, I was just thinking throughout what's being mentioned. I mean, I'm always struck by the need to for people to better understand their responsibilities as well as their rights. So we've been a very rights-focused society. We have a right to take from nature. We have a right to have this, to have more, to, all of these things. But I think when we're talking about people making peace with nature and helping them understand how they should be interacting, and that they should be interacting, and that, we want to inspire them, we want to get them out there, we want them to reconnect, but we need them to do that in such a way that it isn't more of the same sort of one-way traffic approach to engagement with nature or interactions with nature, that they have a right to we want them to understand better, we want them to engage, enjoy, and be inspired by nature. But what is their responsibility to nature? We are part of nature, so we have to help people better understand how they do that, and how they go forward in a different way. Because I mean, God, towards the end of my time at university, there was Al Gore was doing his book tour with The Inconvenient Truth, and that title just always replays in my head so much. It is an inconvenient truth. It is going to be inconvenient. I mean, for me, who's someone who sort of wants to do the right thing, but I know how inconvenient it is because of all of the things that Rob said, the framing and the governance and the market frameworks. It's all driving us towards gaining the rights we believe we're due, but without really having to sort of look hard and do the inconvenient bit of delivering on our responsibilities. So I think there's a pain barrier to break through a number of places, on a personal sort of organization, government level. I think that rights and responsibilities things really resonates with me in terms of how we have to help people move forward.
I totally agree. And yes, I mean that's in an Andean society committed to the rights of Mother Earth, it wouldn't occur to anybody that didn't come with both rights, with responsibilities as well as rights. The reciprocity involves that. But I'm just wondering, we've been answering questions as we go along a little bit, but one of them, what will be the consequences from Colin Brown about adopting a vegan lifestyle might play to this question of responsibilities, and what Rob said about diet. I'm just wondering if anyone has any comment on the idea of veganism or its variants, and its desirability or consequences. That's Rob. Oh no, hang on, Neville's got his hand up.
Well, I need to thread this to another question here, anonymous question around big countries like China, India, Brazil, and others, and the challenges we face. So, as I mentioned earlier, what we eat is probably the most important contribution we can make to the global nature crisis. In 2020, the UK imported around £400 million worth of meat and soybean. So the pressures on the Amazon rainforest from agricultural production are almost not at all to do with the demand in Brazil for agricultural products. They are to do with demand in Europe, North America, and often through China to Europe and North America for products grown in Brazil. So yes, eating less meat, eating locally sourced meat, being deliberate about what we eat, again, is probably the most important individual contribution that we can make. And maybe my final point would be that across the Scottish Wildlife Trust, with a series of extremely well-informed individuals, and possibly at the Scottish Wildlife Trust itself, we all need to be more activist in getting this message across. So there's much more we need to be doing in terms of being vocal, in terms of being prominent, in terms of being out of our comfort zone as citizens, as scientists, to make the point that these issues are not nice to have. They are essential for our and future generations. So we should be more tolerant probably when we see the road is blocked or the trains aren't running or whatever it might be, because some of our fellow campaigners are disrupting society. It may well take that. And we know from many experiences over the previous decades and indeed centuries that transformational change has been driven by individual actions inspiring and cultivating societal shifts. So let's not shy away from being more active in our activism on making peace with nature. Thanks.
Damn right. Is all I can say to that. Rob also has his hand up.
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think so. There was an interesting question about whether or not, if we had a total absence of livestock, that would be negative for some soil health and soil function. So I completely agree with Neville that there are big steps that we can do to shorten global food supply chains to make them much more efficient. We have less loss of food to wastage and things like that. But it is a balancing act. And some of the habitats that we have in Scotland that we value for their nature value are grazed habitats. Hay meadows exist because of the grazing system that are there, a part of it. And actually some of the more efficient food production systems, if you're using locally grown legumes, actually integrate some meat production as well. So, you know, the locally grown protein goes into, for example, chicken feed, and then you can return some of the organic matter there to the soil. So I think if you completely remove livestock from some systems, there would be consequences for that. Having said that, I was thinking again of another source of meat that's potentially out there. Deer are obviously a major problem in Scotland, and I've been involved in discussions about the new Scottish biodiversity strategy, and one of the significant elephants in the room is what we do about overgrazing from deer, which is an issue in many areas of Scotland. So there are alternative routes as well in terms of providing protein that could have conservation benefits, but we shouldn't forget that managed grazing is a part of some of the habitats and landscapes that we value.
Mary has a hand up.
Yes, just to say, following on from what Rob was saying, I think that shortening of the supply chain is what's really key in there, because one of the issues at the moment is it's so difficult to connect what you do in your own home every day with the consequences, the unseen consequences on the other side of the globe, because we just don't know what ingredients have gone in, how it's been made, how it's been produced. And we discussed this a bit in the chat the other day, but that idea that we sometimes get a hero product or something that's everybody becomes aware of, like palm oil is a big problem, everybody knows it, but people have started to be more careful about that. But then all the other products that we're using, I see in the chat somebody talking about ultra processed alternatives to meat and the issues with that. It's very difficult as a consumer buying food for your family to know the impacts of all of those complex supply chains on what you're choosing to eat. And it comes back to what Sarah was saying as well about responsibilities. I think lots of people try to take responsibility, but in the very complex system we live in at the moment, it's very difficult to know which choices to make. So anything that simplifies that, makes shorter supply chains, for me, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I remember after a long time worrying about oil palm conversion in Southeast Asia, I then visited southern Spain and saw the entire landscape replaced by olive tree monoculture, and I thought, well, that's not so good either. But it does connect to the question about councils offering allotments to people who are affected by poverty, and the whole business of I mean, you know, I'm greatly in favour of allotments, partly because they encourage people to actually do something, you know, with nature, partly because they maintain high levels of biodiversity in urban environments, and partly because they alleviate poverty, but also this can be, the allotment concept can also be tied in with the sort of community farm kind of environment education and participatory kind of growing of things in churches, in schools and communities. So personally, I think that's a great idea, but anyone would like to comment? Rob, perhaps?
Yeah, I really like the idea of allotments. I think they are a great tool for connecting people and for also giving the kind of health and well-being benefits people get from green space. So I know, for example, my wife works at Robert Gordon's University. As part of their health work there, they have a small garden as part of the local allotment where they take people to work with them to help with some of their therapies. So I think it's very, very good for us. I think they are a great way of making that link to nature and actually growing anything in schools and working with kids to show them how food is produced using small allotment plots is a really good way. I think a big challenge is that perhaps it's part of this education thing if we need to learn how to do it again. And I know we've started growing vegetables, my wife and I, but in order to remember how to do that, we didn't look back to what our parents did, because our parents stopped growing vegetables because they were making use of the benefits of the Green Revolution, where the vegetables were just turning up, you know, very, very cheaply in the supermarket. It wasn't really an issue. We look back to our grandparents to remember how to grow vegetables and thinking about what we did as kids in our grandparents' gardens. And that for me has always stuck with me, that there's that gap in education and we're losing some of that knowledge. So it's about space and it's about providing space. And I think that's a really nice way to empower people that otherwise wouldn't have the resources by giving them allotment space. But along with that needs to go, again, this educational thing of providing people with the information on how to do that. So it's a bit like, how do you access the countryside? Like, how do we do this again? How do we grow runner beans again? We're forgetting those sort of what we thought were just natural skills. So yeah, but lots of potential from that, I think.
Absolutely, and that's a very positive little uptick to end on, because we've just run out of time, and I need to thank you all very much, both panelists and audience and questioners and so forth. And I'll hand back to Linda to take over the closure of the whole AGM. Thanks very much. Bye.